Over its 20-year history, the Fox 36 has been many things. It was the long travel freeride fork, the enduro race fork, but most recently it's been known as the kind of do-it-all, all-mountain everything fork. While that remains the case, things have gotten a bit more complicated as Fox has split the 36 into two different models. We have the normal 36 right here and the 36 SL. So each is gonna appeal to a specific type of bike and rider, and I'm gonna break those down over a ride on each of these bikes. Stay tuned for that, all the tech details, and my ride impressions as we get through this video. I'm out here in the woods with the new 36 on my Stump Jumper 15. This bike comes with the 36 stock, so in many ways it's ideal to talk about the platform on, but I am running it right now with a 160 fork up front. I think that feels pretty nice on this bike. And in many ways, this bike represents a lot of what the 36 is aiming for. A super capable mid-travel bike that kind of does everything, but requires a fork to be very good in order to keep up with the back end. And the 36 definitely does that. I'm gonna talk all the little internal details as I'm descending, but for now, I'll leave it with this. Again, a 160 fork up front. I'm running the Grip X2 damper. And this is obviously the factory version. It's got the Kashima and all that good stuff. You know, there are tons actually of little touch points that have changed on the 36, but it's best to keep all those until the end. I don't want to bore you all with the fussy details. So I'm going to drop in, talk a bit about the fork.
There are a lot of little details that add up to making the 36 more capable than its predecessor, and even getting it to approach the 38. First of all, it's 20% stiffer over the previous model, which puts it at almost 90% of the stiffness of the 38. Now, obviously we don't think of fork performance in terms of percentages, but suffice to say it tracks really nicely and does hold a line very well, especially when the wheel is kind of deflecting off of rocks and roots and things like that. The arch plays a role in that funky looking generative arch. You know, all that is optimizing the shape of things and making sure that there's no excess material. And that helps it be a little bit lighter than the previous 36 as well. Inside the fork, out of view, we have the updated air spring. Fox is calling this the Glide Core technology. That Glide Core technology is a set of elastomers that separate the air spring from the rest of the fork. So when you're going through rough terrain, having the chassis deflect and twist and bend, the air spring itself remains unfazed. So it has less friction in it, it won't bind, and it is just generally less affected by the rest of the fork's performance. Speaking of the rest of that performance, there are a few different damper options available to approach different price points and different use cases. So the base damper is going to be the Grip that we all know and love. It's just a simple sweep up top. You've got the Grip X, which has high and low speed compression adjustment and low speed rebound. It's a little bit lighter than the flagship damper, which is the Grip X2, which has high and low speed compression and rebound adjustment, and I would say is by a margin the best performer of the three. The rest of the performative upgrades to the 36 have to do with friction and how the fork performs under load. Now, the first of those is going to be the increased bushing overlap, which is a 30mm increase over the previous design. What that means is that when you're deeper in travel, really pushing the fork through rough stuff, it's going to feel less like it's kind of bending on itself and just keep everything in line. They've also moved the bypass channels to the interior face of the lower arch, where those little grooves that allow oil to continue to circulate in the fork will have less of an effect on the friction. The last little touch point differences that have changed come down to the bleeders, which are lower profile and easier to use, the air spring top cap, which now uses a standard cassette wrench as opposed to the fancy Fox chamfered wrench, and the cleaner mudguard mounting rather. It's just 4 bolts as opposed to having to do anything with the bleed buttons themselves.
All right, I am now out here on my Tallboy 5. So I'm riding the 36 SL on this bike. I have run it with a 130 and a 140 fork. This is the 140 up front right now. This is essentially just a lighter weight version of the 36. A lot of different things have been done to shave weight on this, and they shave a pretty significant amount. Depending on the specs, it's a few hundred grams, which is, you know, that's not nothing. And it comes in many different forms. I'll get into those in depth in a moment, but suffice to say, it feels ideal for a bike like this. The Tallboy is only 120 mil travel, but feels much more capable than that, and definitely is suited to a burlier fork than something a bit more cross-country oriented. You know, I just reviewed that 34 SL last week. I wouldn't put that on this bike, but 36 SL feels a bit more appropriate, even though they both come in 130 mil travel. I'm gonna err on the bigger fork for this bike, so makes sense to me. I think that there are a lot of, let's say, like capable beyond numbers trail bikes on the market right now. It's a really popular segment, and for those people who want to keep the weight low but still have a fairly composed and capable fork, I think the 36 SL will kind of balance that nicely.
The 36 SL shares many of the same updates as the 36, but in its own completely different chassis. So that chassis is meant to save a ton of weight over the stock 36 and appeal more towards those lower travel bikes, where the typical 36 in 160 mil travel hits around 1920 grams. The 36 SL is around 1755. So compared to the old 34, it's about 60 to 70 grams heavier, but it does perform a lot better, I would say. Having ridden the 34 extensively, the stiffness you get out of the 36 SL is definitely more appropriate for those 120 to 140 mil bikes that aren't cross-country bikes. I think the new 34 SL that I reviewed last week will be applicable for some of the crossover terrain here because that is lighter than the previous 34, but for most people who are looking for a hard-charging, short-travel bike, I think the 36 SL is going to appeal to that audience. So it's available in 120, 130, and 140 millimeters of travel for 29-inch wheels only. It's coming stock with the Grip X damper, but like the 36, you could run the Grip X2, you could run the Grip, and I think in the shortest travel here, you could even run the Grip SL, or even like the 120 and 130 variants. So that would save even more weight over the 36. For me, I've been running it in 130 and 140 with the Grip X damper, and I think in time I'm gonna want to put a Grip X2 in there. Yes, it does add about 60 grams to the fork, but I think that that is a very worthwhile addition when it comes to the performance. The Grip X damper does suit a lot of trail bikes decently well, but I think once you've ridden the Grip X2, it's kind of hard to detune the fork to something simpler and a little bit lighter when you could have the full performance. So in terms of how exactly the 36 SL saves so much weight over the 36, that comes down to a few different details. It has a 180 mil post mount for the brake. It also has a generative arch that is aired a bit more towards weight savings than all-out stiffness, even though the fork is 20% stiffer than the previous 34. Other details include the Cobalt SL axle as opposed to the pinch axle seen on the 36. And then the Glide Core air spring is a slightly lighter version of the same technology. Because that shorter length fork will be deflecting less, you don't need quite as much separation of air spring and chassis, and as a result, it's a pared down version of the same technology.
All right, wrapping things up here in the dungeon, I've walked you through what bikes I think these forks are most appropriate for, what kind of rider they might appeal to, but I think it's worth reiterating why Fox decided to split the 36 into two different things. It's gonna confuse some people, especially because they essentially have the same name. The way I look at it is like, this is the Lyric equivalent, this is the Pike equivalent, but I think more than that, it's like, this is the more capable fork, and then this is the one that makes some concessions for weight. You know, a lot of details on them are similar, and the feel is similar. I haven't had the opportunity to ride the 36 SL with that Grip X2 damper, but I think with that in here, it could feel even more identical in a lot of ways, but ultimately, like, the 36 is the more capable fork. That comes down to it obviously being longer travel, but it's just, it has a stickier feel to it. It's a bit more planted on trail, especially because of like the tracking stiffness that it carries, where the 36 SL feels like it does just make more sense for those shorter travel bikes. You know, if I were speccing a 140 bike for myself, I'd probably go with the full 36 as opposed to a 140 36 SL, unless I were building it for like weight above all else. I'm curious how people think about these though, because that's going to be a tricky consideration in those crossover points. All in all, you know, I think they did a great job here. I'm particularly a big fan of the 36. And I think that in due time, as I finish up the long-term reviews, I'll be talking about them relative to the Lyric, to the Pike, to other, you know, all-mountain trail forks on the market. So stay tuned for that. Touching on price, finally, there's a range, you know, like all Fox products. There's the Performance Elite, and Factory series of each of these. These are both factory forks. They've got the Kashima coating up top, but the Performance Elite forks will be identical performance-wise, save for the gold stanchions. The base model Performance series stuff is around $700 USD for each fork, and then those prices climb all the way up to about $1,200 for the factory series, with, you know, staggered price points in between. The 36 SL is a touch cheaper, but not a ton. That's the new lineup. Those are the 36s. And as we saw last week, there's the new 34 as well. So I'm curious what people are making of the new Fox lineup. You know, there's a lot of numbers thrown around. It can get a bit confusing, but with the 36 being the kind of flagship medium big fork in their lineup now, I'm curious how people think about these smaller alternatives and on what bikes they might ride them. So let me know what you think. Until then, stay tuned for more videos. Stick around, we've got plenty of stuff coming down the pipe. And head over to pinkbike.com for my full write-up on these forks and plenty of other stuff. Thank you.